Good evening. This is the memorial lecture for Comrade Chris HANI, which is being done in conjunction with the ANC Youth League in the Greater Tshwane region. In memory of Comrade Chris HANI, the time had come for our people to take back their power that had been wrestled from his dying hands. The 10th of April, 1993 is a day when almost all of us older South Africans can remember where we were and what we were doing. The very moment when the news first spread like wildfire that Comrade Martin Tembisile, Comrade Chris as we knew him, HANI had been assassinated. For our country, it was a deeply traumatic watershed moment. The sense of loss and anger was immense. The poor and oppressed people of South Africa knew instinctively, without having had to be told so, that the moment that Janusz Wallace pulled the trigger of the gun that he was given by that right-winger, Clive Derby-Lewis, and left Comrade Chris's bloodied and lifeless body in the driveway of his Dawn Park residence, they had been robbed of their champion and one of the greatest leaders that had emerged from the liberation struggle. It was a day that desperation reigned, and much of our revolutionary innocence was lost. Indeed, it was the day when many of us realized that there were deeply reactionary and sinister forces at work to prevent us as a nation from achieving our full liberation. Perhaps even more than ever before. And since it was a fateful day that brought the message home that there are those among us, both nationally and internationally, who were prepared to stop at nothing, including to kill our true leaders, to defend their own power and privilege, and to keep the people subjugated, poor, and exploited. As the waves of anger of the people convulsed through the length and breadth of our country, in rural areas, and in small towns and cities, in urban areas, it was evident that the people's anger was driven by a deep sense of loss. The angry crowds that marched over that Easter weekend in the drenching rain in Khayelitsha, and also in the scorching Highveld sun to the Orlando East police station, knew that they were robbed of hope and were left exposed and vulnerable, in sobbing for their loss. And in their cries of despair and anger were embedded the very fear for a future without the most prominent, popular, and articulate voice representing the needs and the demands of the working class and the poor. Comrade Chris HANI combined in his warm and larger-than-life personality the passionate heart of a committed communist, with a strategical ability to carry his commitment for the empowerment of the poor forward within the context of the broad national liberation movement that the African National Congress is. That ability is what made him immensely dangerous to those who did not share his revolutionary ideals, because it made him the personification of how communism could be mainstreamed instead of marginalized, and remain at the center of our wide and sometimes almost too diverse national liberation movement. Comrade Chris's commitment to the national liberation struggle, and specifically his commitment as a solid and long-standing member of the African National Congress, could never be questioned. His discipline in the face of provocation and even disrespect, such as when he as the then Chief of Staff of Umkhonto we Sizwe was not consulted by the National Executive Committee of the ANC about the decision to suspend the armed struggle and eventually disband Umkhonto we Sizwe was legendary. Despite being deeply hurt and angered about how that decision was taken, and not at all convinced that it was the correct step to take at that particular time, he accepted it under protest with remarkable discipline and provided to all of us a lesson in the practice of what was truly democratic centralism and its demands. This turned out to be Comrade Chris's greatest strength, because in doing so he secured for himself a place at the critical center of power among the leaders of the African National Congress. A position that entitled him to ask the difficult questions about where the negotiations for the transition to our democracy were ultimately taking us. We all know how worried he was about the sunset clauses that were agreed to in the negotiations, and how those continue to haunt us to this very day. If only we had listened to him then. Comrade Chris spoke fearlessly and frankly about his deep-seated concerns about some of the trends for self-enrichment, elitism, and conspicuous consumption that he saw emerging among some of his fellow ANC comrades, even during those early stages of the difficult birth of our democracy, when the negotiations were still in progress. He was not adverse to call a spade, and to refer to these as sell-out tendencies. Nor was he shy to ask what were the motives for some of the awful compromises that were made during the negotiations. Whether it was a hunger for self-advancement and self-enrichment by an emerging comprador black capitalist class within the ANC, or concern for the advancement of the empowerment of the poor. There was no one else within the core leadership of the ANC at a time when we were not yet in government who could so clearly foresee the conduct of some among us when they were eventually to get into positions of power. As we look today at the lifestyles, the displays of wealth and conspicuous consumption among many of us deployed as ministers and senior government officials, it is disconcerting to go back to the prophetic words of Comrade Chris. I open quote, "What I fear is that the liberators emerge as elitists who drive around in Mercedes-Benzes and use the resources of this country to live in palaces and to gather riches." Close quote. In the months before he was assassinated, Comrade Chris became increasingly vocal about his concerns that far too much was being given away and compromised in the negotiations with the apartheid regime. With a clear 2020 vision of a true revolution, he saw de Klerk for the unrepentant scheming manipulator and killer that he was when he said, and I quote again, "I disagree with a lot of people who think that de Klerk and others have changed, because de Klerk and others have done nothing about removing the apartheid forces that they created." Close quote. In referring to those apartheid forces, he certainly also meant the white monopoly capitalist forces and their continued control of the South African economy after the advent of our democracy, which was the ultimate objective of de Klerk and his National Party negotiators, and I dare say an objective in which they almost totally and sadly succeeded. that Comrade Chris was not prepared to live with the consequences of these unpalatable compromises into perpetuity. And being the people's leader that he was expressed in his commitment in straightforward and uncompromising language that the poor masses of our people and in our country could understand and could relate to in their daily lives of deprivation and suffering. And this made him very dangerous. Of course, he was the number one enemy and target of the white monopoly capitalists, who feared that he could scramble and unscramble the cozy settlement that they have managed to secure for themselves in the negotiations. But sadly, he also increasingly became the enemy for some of his fellow comrades. These so-called comrades were no longer thinking of the negotiated settlement as temporary and a strategic beachhead from where the struggle could proceed for the full economic transformation of the South African economy and the full empowerment of the black, especially African, poor majority. Instead, for some of them who already during the negotiations were striking deals with white monopoly capitalists, the negotiated settlement had become a safe haven for their own ambitions of self-enrichment. Thus, the process of writing the final constitution in the Constitutional Assembly after the 27th of April 1994 elections was for them simply a means to entrench and consolidate this safe haven into a permanent fortress, built on the foundation of the new allegiances that they have formed. When Comrade Chris said, barely a month before he was assassinated, and I quote him again, "The perks of a new government are not really appealing to me. Everybody would like to have a good job and good salary. But for me, that is not the all of the struggle. What is important is the continuation of the struggle. The real problems of the country are not whether one is in cabinet, but what we do for the social upliftment of the working masses of our country." Close quote. When he said this, they stood exposed, and he placed the fear of God in them. In the future South Africa, that the white monopoly capitalists and their black elite comprador capitalist strategic partners envisaged, there was no place for the views and likes of Comrade Chris Hani. He either had to be marginalized to the point of being made irrelevant or permanently removed. Because of his uncanny ability to avoid marginalization and to stay with a growing constituency of the working class and the poor masses at the center of the leadership and power in the national liberation movement, only the latter option remained. It is most disconcerting and spine-chilling to say this, but the logic is relentless. The truth about all who were involved in Comrade Chris's assassination and how it was done still needs to be exposed. Our national liberation movement, with its long history, the credibility that comes with it, and the deep love of our people for the ANC, made it the only force that could legitimize the deeply flawed, capitalist, elitist settlement that had been forged. The problem was that Comrade Chris was not in on this and was determined not to allow it to happen, and therefore he had to be permanently removed. In the turmoil and chaos that followed the aftermath of the assassination of Comrade Chris, this is what the poor masses of the people instinctively felt and what fueled their anger and their sense of grave loss. It was only because of our people's love for the ANC that Madiba was, the night after the assassination, able to make a national broadcast on all the SABC television and radio channels and quell their legitimate anger. That night, power shifted from de Klerk, who was helpless to control our people's anger, to Madiba and to the ANC. However, it also confirmed the careful calculations of white monopoly capital that it was only the ANC that could control the situation, secure the negotiated settlement, and ultimately protect their interests. In reality, the societal power of the ANC and the special place of love that it has in the hearts of our people was a double-edged sword that could also be wielded against the best interests and full liberation of our people. And sadly, it increasingly became so since. It is only when understanding this that it makes sense to understand what is meant when we call for the ANC to regain its revolutionary heart. That revolutionary heart that was personified in Comrade Chris and the ideals that he fought for and ultimately sacrificed his life. When we remind ourselves that the liberation struggle was not about palatial residences, designer clothes, and luxury German sedans and SUVs, but about the return of the stolen land to the people, we return to what was at the very heart of the formation of the ANC in 1912. When we call for the ANC to return to the values of the Freedom Charter and its core liberation message that the people shall share in the country's wealth, we reassert what is the revolutionary heart of the ANC. Similarly, when we insist that the pro-radical economic transformation resolutions of the 54th National Conference of the ANC must be implemented and resist those who do not want to do so, we fight for the revolutionary heart of the ANC. In doing so, we reaffirm what Comrade Chris encouraged the ANC with a true revolutionary heart to strive for, when he said, and I quote him again, "Socialism is about a decent shelter for those who are homeless. It is about water for those who have no safe drinking water. It is about health care. It is about a life of dignity for the old. It is about overcoming the huge divide between urban and rural areas. It is about a decent education for all our people. Socialism is about rolling back the tyranny of the market. As long as the economy is dominated by an unelected, privileged few, the case for socialism will always exist." Close quote. It was with a deep sense of sadness and loss that we recall the sacrifices and commitment of Comrade Chris Hani. He was indeed the quintessential freedom fighter who was prepared to sacrifice everything for the liberation of his people. When he left South Africa and went into exile and joined Umkhonto we Sizwe, he threw his whole being into the liberation struggle. His own words describe that singular commitment best when he said, "My basic objective is struggle in South Africa. You know, I could have left you and to see others do so and to go and study. I had a degree from Rhodes University, but I felt that I was not going to go and study. It was my revolutionary duty to be part of the armed struggle of the revolution of South Africa. It was this commitment to serve selflessly that saw Comrade Chris rising through the ranks of MK and the ANC in exile, eventually to become the Chief of Staff of Umkhonto weSizwe and a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. But we also remember that this was not without its own hitches. We remember the Chris HANI memorandum, which raised serious concerns about the manner in which the African National Congress functioned in exile, and how those issues that he raised so fearlessly eventually was dealt with at the Morogoro Conference, and indeed made a major shift in the ANC's ability to work for our liberation from exile. As Comrade Chris himself said, after Morogoro, and after we raised those critical issues, we never looked back. We remember how fearless he was when he was managing MK operations from Lesotho. He placed himself in grave danger of cross-border raids by the Boers. But Comrade Chris always led from the front. He was a soldier's soldier. And it was his ardent belief that you cannot expect your fellow comrades to face dangers and make sacrifices that you yourself, as their commander, are not prepared to face and make. He turned this belief into the guiding light of his life. And that is why our people instinctively believed in him and why they trusted him so much. Comrade Chris was always a strong voice of consciousness in our movement. He spoke out and was prepared to be critical about mistakes that he believed the leadership were making, especially when they showed tendencies of arrogance and elitism that distanced themselves from ordinary cadres. The well-being of the rank and file ANC members and the MK cadres in the training camps were always his greatest concern. That also came very clearly through in the HANI memorandum, where he raised those concerns and the manner in which ordinary comrades were treated as compared to what he considered to be a leadership elite. However, in doing so, he was never ill-disciplined or factional. Ultimately, he always subjected himself to the collective wisdom and discipline of the ANC. Up to his dying day, Comrade Chris was first and foremost an exemplary cadre of the African National Congress. His blood was truly black, green, and gold. He was the personification of the revolutionary heart of the ANC. As I've said, the societal power and unique place that the African National Congress has in the hearts of our people is sometimes a double-edged sword. In the wrong hands, it can be wielded against the people to legitimize oppression and exploitation, and allowing a comprador black elite to rule. However, in the right hands, the ANC is second to none in its influence for radical transformation and revolutionary power. As the leader of society, to fulfill the historic liberation mission that it was indeed founded for. Thus, to achieve what the longest-serving president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo, so clearly articulated when he said, to carry the historical revolutionary task on its soldiers to lead our people to achieve their own liberation. On the 10th of April 1993, Comrade HANI lost his life because he was committed to the empowerment and full liberation of the majority of black and especially African poor South Africans. The bloodied hands of the assassins of Comrade Chris wrestled the powerful sword that the ANC is from his dying hands, and also from the hands of our people. The time has come. The time has come for our people to take it back. Yes, in memory of Comrade Chris, but especially in pursuit of our own full liberation. That concludes the lecture. I will be prepared to respond to written questions as they are sent in now. Otherwise, I can also deal with those issues or questions that you may want to raise when you respond to the recorded video of this memorial lecture that will remain on our Radical Economic Transformation Facebook group page. I will now pause for a moment to see if there are questions or particular points that those who have viewed this lecture would like to raise. If not so, I will, after a minute or so, conclude this broadcast. I do not see any questions being raised, so it is for me now to thank all of you who have taken the time to participate in this live lecture, and especially to do so in memory of one of the greatest revolutionaries that the African National Congress produced, and someone who truly dedicated his life and gave his life for the liberation of his people. Let us never forget what Comrade HANI stood for. And let us never forget to commemorate Comrade HANI's life, especially on the 10th of April every year, when he was assassinated by right-wing counter-revolutionary forces. Once again, many thanks for having listened to this lecture. I remind you that next week there will be another lecture on Wednesday by Professor Chris Malekani, who will deal with issues around the South African Reserve Bank and why and how the South African Reserve Bank needs to be nationalized. Thank you and good night.